The smell hit first. Pine resin mixed with kerosene, sharp enough to sting the nostrils even from 100 yards away. Then came the sound. Metal scraping wood as iron nails drove through oak planks, sealing doors that would never open again. In the darkness of an Alabama forest on March 9, 1876, a freedman named Elijah Carter worked methodically. His hammer strikes timed between the muffled voices inside the lodge where 32 hooded men debated which black family to terrorize next. This is the story of how one night's careful rage reduced the Ku Klux Klan's most violent chapter to ash and screams, and how the man who did it vanished into a freedom purchased with fire. Before we descend into those flames, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this pull you in, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in county records and whispered warnings for nearly 150 years. 12 miles outside Selma, deep in timber country where cypress roots strangled the earth and fog clung to morning like guilty secrets, the Klan had built their sanctuary. The lodge squatted in a clearing carved from virgin forest, a rough-hewn structure with no windows and a single entrance, perfect for secrecy, fatal for escape. Local white folks knew about the meetings but pretended ignorance, the same way they pretended not to notice which barns burned after which gatherings, which wells got poisoned, which bodies turned up in the Alabama River with stones tied to their ankles. Elijah Carter had reasons more specific than justice. 3 months earlier, on December 14, 1875, night riders had visited his sister's homestead. Sarah Carter Washington had married a man who'd learned to read during the war, who'd registered to vote, who'd spoken at a Freedmen's Bureau meeting about land ownership. The Klan considered this uppity behavior requiring correction. They dragged Thomas Washington from his bed while Sarah screamed, while their 4 children watched from corners like terrified shadows. They'd strung him from the same oak tree where he'd proposed to Sarah 6 years before, his body twisting in lamplight, while hooded men sang hymns about racial purity and God's natural order. Sarah never recovered. She stopped speaking, stopped eating, her mind retreating to some interior country where her husband still breathed. By February, she was dead, leaving 4 orphaned children and 1 brother whose grief crystallized into something harder than diamond, sharper than any tool forged in his blacksmith shop. Elijah had been gathering intelligence for 2 months, listening to white men talk when they thought he was just another Negro shoeing their horses, invisible in the way useful labor always is. He learned the lodge's location, the meeting schedule, always the 2nd Saturday of each month, the names of members, the fact that they locked the door from inside for privacy, that they kept a barrel of kerosene for their ceremonial cross burnings, that kerosene would serve a different ceremony tonight. How many times had Elijah shod the horses of the men who killed his brother-in-law? How many times had he nodded respectfully while they discussed the Negro problem as if he couldn't understand English? Survival under white terror meant becoming a mirror that reflected nothing back, showing them only what they expected to see. Deference, simplicity, contentment with subjugation. But mirrors can break. March 9th was moonless, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything except firelight. Elijah had positioned himself in the woods hours before the meeting, watching Klan members arrive on horseback, dismount, change into their robes under the cover of trees before approaching the lodge. 32 men by his count, including the sheriff, 2 county commissioners, a Baptist preacher, and the store owner who'd extended Elijah credit just last week, with a smile that never reached his eyes. They filed inside carrying torches, their voices rising in ritualistic chants about blood purity and Southern pride. The door closed. A wooden bar dropped into place on the interior, their standard security measure, meant to keep outsiders from witnessing their ceremonies. Tonight, that bar would become their tomb's seal. Elijah waited 20 minutes, letting them settle into their meeting, their guard dropping as whiskey passed and speeches about white supremacy gained momentum. He'd brought 4 bags of nails, a claw hammer, and enough boards to brace every exit. The kerosene barrel sat outside, waiting for its consecration. He moved like smoke through darkness, his blacksmith's hands working with practiced efficiency. The first nail through the first board made almost no sound. He'd wrapped the hammer's head in cloth to muffle each strike. Board after board, nail after nail, he sealed that single entrance while 32 voices inside debated which freedmen's crops to destroy, which black church to burn, which children to orphan next. The terrible mathematics of justice. One door sealed tight. One barrel of kerosene emptied against weathered wood. One match struck with the steady hand of a man who'd counted the cost and found it acceptable. What would you do, standing in those trees with your sister's ghost whispering in your ear? Would you walk away and let the law handle men who were the law? Or would you become the fire that cleanses? Elijah Carter struck that match at exactly 10:47 p.m., and for the first time in months, he smiled as flames caught hold and raced up the lodge walls like judgment ascending toward heaven. The flames climbed the lodge walls like eager fingers reaching for choir robes and flesh. Beneath, inside, the first man to notice wasn't the sheriff or the preacher, but a timber merchant named Crawford, who'd positioned himself near the door out of habit. He always liked knowing his exits. He smelled smoke before he saw it, that acrid bite cutting through whiskey fumes and torch smoke. When he turned, orange light was already seeping through gaps in the doorframe, and something about the way it moved, hungry and deliberate, made his throat close. "Fire," he said, the word catching like a fishbone. Then louder, "Fire." The meeting dissolved into chaos before anyone understood the mathematics of their situation. Men rushed toward the door, 32 bodies funneling toward a single point of escape, pushing and shoving with the courtesy of drowning rats. The Grand Cyclops, a rail-thin lawyer named Pemberton, who'd orchestrated Thomas Washington's lynching, reached the door first and threw his weight against it. It didn't budge. Outside, Elijah had retreated 50 yards into the tree line, far enough for safety, close enough to hear. The screams started at 10:51 p.m., individual voices at first, then blending into a chorus that had no words, just terror in its purest distillation. He'd wrapped cloth around the lower half of his face, not for disguise, but to filter the smoke that was already thickening the air, carrying with it the smell of burning pine and something else, something that made even him, who'd planned this down to the final nail, feel his stomach clench. Hooded men were burning. Their cries echoed through Alabama darkness like prayers God refused to answer. 3 miles away, Ezra Thompson sat on his porch, nursing bad whiskey and worse memories. He was a freedman who'd lost his son to a Klan raid 2 years prior, watched from hiding as they'd beaten the boy to death for the crime of looking a white woman in the eye. Everyone in the black community knew Ezra had changed after that night, something vital inside him going dark and quiet as an abandoned well. When the first screams reached his ears, faint but unmistakable, carrying on wind that smelled like judgment, Ezra stood slowly. He walked to the edge of his property where forest began, and listened with the concentration of a man at prayer. After 5 minutes, he smiled for the first time since his son's funeral, raised his whiskey bottle toward those distant screams, and drank deep. "Burn," he whispered. "Burn clean." Back at the lodge, desperation had evolved into something darker. Men threw themselves at the door with combined force, but Elijah's carpentry held firm. He'd braced those boards at angles that distributed impact across multiple anchor points. The interior bar, meant to protect their secrecy, now trapped them as effectively as any prison. Some men tried to dig under the walls where they met dirt floor, fingernails splitting against packed earth and foundation stones. Others searched frantically for tools, weapons, anything that might breach wood and nail before smoke claimed them. The fire had found the kerosene-soaked western wall and accelerated with predatory speed. Flames raced across the ceiling where pitch pine beams provided perfect fuel, raining burning embers onto the hooded figures below. The robes themselves, white cotton designed to inspire terror, caught fire with enthusiastic efficiency. Sheriff William Hodge, who'd signed off on dozens of false reports about Negro criminals while ignoring Klan violence, found himself engulfed in flames that cared nothing for his badge or his authority. He screamed for help, for water, for God, getting only smoke and heat in response. His last coherent thought, before pain erased thinking entirely, was a bitter recognition that he was dying exactly as he'd planned for others to die. Surrounded by his own, with no mercy coming. The lodge had become an oven with living contents. But here's what the county records don't mention. The farmhand who rode past on his way home at 11 p.m. saw the flames, heard the screams, and kept riding. The sharecropper's wife who noticed orange light in the forest and closed her shutters without waking her husband. The black preacher who watched smoke rise against starlit sky and fell to his knees, torn between Christian mercy and Old Testament satisfaction, who ultimately stayed kneeling until the screams stopped, then rose and went inside to pray for souls he couldn't quite convince himself to forgive. Elijah watched the fire consume the structure he'd sealed so carefully, his blacksmith's eye noting how the heat caused the boards to warp and tighten rather than loosen, how his nails held true, even as wood around them charred. He'd built this trap to last exactly long enough, calculated burn time against structural integrity, with the precision he normally reserved for horseshoes and iron gates. A section of roof collapsed at 11:17 p.m., sending sparks spiraling into darkness like furious fireflies. The screams had changed quality by then, becoming weaker, more spaced out, some voices falling silent while others still clawed at consciousness through smoke inhalation and flame. The smell had grown worse, moving beyond burning wood into territory that made even revenge taste like ash in the mouth. How long does it take for justice to burn? How hot must the fire be to calcinate bone and hate in equal measure? Elijah stayed until 11:43 p.m., when the last scream faded into the fire's crackling monologue. Only then did he gather his tools, including the hammer that had driven 37 nails through pine boards, and begin the long walk back to Selma through woods that knew every freedman's path, every hiding place, every route toward something that might, if you squinted through smoke and prayer, resemble freedom. Behind him, the lodge continued its transformation from meeting place to funeral pyre, from symbol of terror to monument of ash, while 32 bodies collapsed into carbon and silence beneath a sky that held no moon to witness their ending. Sunrise arrived like an unwanted witness, pale light filtering through smoke that still rose from the lodge's skeleton. By 6:30 a.m. on March 10, 1876, The fire had reduced itself to glowing embers and the kind of silence that follows catastrophe. What remained of the structure stood like a charred rib cage, blackened support beams jutting at angles, sections of wall that hadn't quite surrendered to flame and scattered throughout, shapes that had once been men now rendered into forms that forensic science couldn't yet properly name. Deputy Marshal James Wickham reached the site first, summoned by a logger who'd spotted smoke at dawn. Wickham was a transplant from Ohio, sent south during Reconstruction with ideals about justice that Alabama had been slowly beating out of him for 3 years. He'd learned to look the other way when Klan violence erupted, had signed reports listing Negro deaths as accidents or suicides, had become complicit through calculated cowardice. Now he stood at the clearing's edge, staring at remains that made his breakfast threaten rebellion. The smell was what broke him. Not just burning, but something organic and fundamental turned to ash. He counted bodies by boots, some still partially intact where flames hadn't reached. 32 pairs, a meeting's worth of members, all dead in a structure someone had very deliberately sealed shut. From Deputy Marshal Wickham's official report, filed March 11, 1876. Evidence of exterior barricading, nails driven through planking at doorframe, kerosene residue on western wall, deaths attributed to smoke inhalation and fire, investigation ongoing into identity of perpetrator. What Wickham's report didn't mention, the way his hands shook as he wrote it, or how he spent that night drinking himself unconscious while his wife asked questions he couldn't answer, or the small, terrible part of him that whispered good when he'd first understood what he was seeing. News spread through Selma faster than the fire had spread through Pine. By noon, white families gathered in tight clusters, their conversations sharp with fear and speculation. Who had done this? How had they known about the meeting? Was this the beginning of a Negro uprising, revenge for generations of subjugation finally manifesting in organized violence? The black community received the news differently. Conversations happened in lowered voices, in kitchens and fields and churches, passed between people who'd learned to communicate in glances and careful phrases. No one celebrated publicly, that would be suicide, but in the privacy of homes where white folks never entered. There were prayers of thanksgiving disguised as prayers for the dead. There were tears of relief mistaken for tears of sorrow. Elijah Carter went to work that morning as he always did, opening his blacksmith shop at 7 a.m., heating his son's forge, shaping iron with the same steady competence he'd shown for years. When white customers arrived with news of the tragedy, he responded with appropriate shock and concern, his face a masterwork of controlled reaction. Inside, where thoughts lived free from performance, he felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not regret. Just a hollow space where his sister and brother-in-law used to exist. One customer, a farmer named Dutton whose boots Elijah had noticed among those 32 pairs, never arrived for his scheduled appointment. His horse stood in Dutton's barn, confused by the absence of routine. His children woke to a mother's tears and no father at breakfast. His widow would remarry within a year, choosing a man who attended Methodist services instead of midnight meetings, as if denomination could protect against consequence. The investigation that followed was theater performed for an audience that demanded vengeance but couldn't decide on a target. Federal authorities arrived from Montgomery on March 13th, bringing resources and jurisdiction that local law enforcement lacked. They interviewed freedmen and white citizens alike, searching for witnesses, patterns, anyone who might have known about the meeting or harbored enough rage to orchestrate mass murder. But here's the truth about investigations in 1876 Alabama. They only worked when the community wanted them to work. White witnesses suddenly developed amnesia about Klan membership. They'd heard rumors, sure, but couldn't confirm specifics. The lodge? Just a hunting cabin, far as they knew. The dead men? Respectable citizens, churchgoers, family men. Any suggestion they'd been engaged in racial terrorism was slander against the deceased. Black witnesses were even less helpful, employing the practiced opacity of people who understood that cooperation with white authority rarely improved their situation. No, they hadn't seen anything unusual that night. No, they didn't know of anyone with particular grievance against those specific white men. No, they couldn't imagine who might possess the skills and materials necessary to barricade a building and set it ablaze. Elijah was questioned twice. The first interview lasted 12 minutes, conducted in his shop while he worked, the investigator's questions bouncing off his measured responses like hammers off cold iron. The second interview, 3 days later, was more aggressive. They'd learned he was related to Thomas Washington, had clear motive for revenge. But motive without evidence was just speculation, and Elijah's alibi was airtight. He'd been home with his elderly mother, who confirmed her son had spent the entire evening in her presence, helping with chores, reading scripture aloud, retiring early. His mother, Mary Carter, was 73 years old and had spent 6 decades enslaved before emancipation. When the investigator asked if she was certain about the timeline, she fixed him with eyes that had witnessed horrors he couldn't imagine, and said with absolute conviction that her son had been with her, that she knew exactly where her children were at all times, that questioning her truthfulness was questioning her capacity as a mother. The investigator retreated under the weight of her stare. 32 funerals happened over 5 days, Selma's churches working overtime to accommodate the dead. Preachers struggled with eulogies that balanced grief and whitewashing, praising men's public virtues while carefully avoiding any mention of their night work. Widows wept genuinely. Whatever their husbands had done in darkness, they'd still been providers, partners, fathers. Children mourned parents without fully understanding why their deaths seemed to trouble adults in complicated ways. The Black community watched those funerals from appropriate distances, faces arranged in expressions of sympathy that masked calculations about what this death toll meant for their safety. Would retaliation come? Would angry whites lash out at random freedmen, seeking revenge against an entire race for one man's actions? Or would this act of violence finally make white terrorists understand that terror has a price? The answer would reveal itself in the weeks ahead, in patterns of intimidation that either intensified or evaporated, in decisions made by men who suddenly had to consider whether their hooded violence might purchase their own immolation, in the fragile mathematics of fear recalibrated by 32 pairs of boots arranged around a mass grave. But first, investigators had to eliminate one final suspect, a freedman blacksmith with a dead sister, steady hands, and an alibi that couldn't be broken no matter how hard they pressed. Metal sang against metal in Elijah Carter's shop. Each hammer struck a punctuation mark in conversations he wasn't supposed to understand. The third interrogation came on March 18th, conducted by a federal marshal named Thaddeus Cole, who'd earned a reputation during the war for extracting information from Confederate prisoners. Cole arrived without announcement at 7:15 a.m., watching Elijah work for 10 minutes before speaking, studying the way a blacksmith's hands moved. Precise, controlled, capable of driving nails through oak planks in darkness. "You know why I'm here?" Cole said finally, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man accustomed to compliance. Elijah continued shaping a horseshoe, the iron glowing orange as sunset. "I expect you're investigating the fire, sir. Terrible thing, all those men dead. Your brother-in-law was lynched by Klan members 3 months ago." "Yes, sir, he was." The hammer struck, sending sparks across the anvil's face. "Thomas was a good man. Read the Bible every night to his children." Cole circled the shop, noting tools, materials, the orderly way everything was arranged. That kind of loss makes a man angry, makes him want revenge. "Anger doesn't bring back the dead, sir. My sister learned that before she passed." The marshal stopped, turning to face Elijah directly. "You have the skills to barricade a building. You have access to materials, nails, hammer, kerosene. You have motive stronger than most. And you have an alibi that depends entirely on your elderly mother's testimony." Elijah plunged the horseshoe into water, steam hissing like serpents disturbed. "My mother doesn't lie, Marshal. 73 years old, spent most of them enslaved. If she says I was home reading scripture with her, then I was home reading scripture with her. Convenient that the only witness is family. Inconvenient that I'm the only blacksmith for 12 miles, sir. Every horse in this county passes through my shop eventually. Kill me or hang me for something I didn't do, and white folks will be shoeing their own horses. Economics sometimes protects better than innocence." The truth of this statement hung between them like smoke. Cole had already heard complaints from local whites about the investigation's focus on Elijah. He was useful labor, skilled and reliable, someone you didn't discard without replacement. Reconstruction had complicated the mathematics of racial violence. You couldn't just murder any Negro who looked suspicious anymore, especially if that Negro provided services the community needed. Still, Cole pressed. "Your mother's eyesight failing at her age? Sharp as ever. Her memory reliable? Better than mine, sir. Can recite every child she birthed, every master who owned her, every scar and how she earned it. Woman forgets nothing." Cole tried a different approach. "Someone in the black community knows who did this. Someone's protecting the killer." Elijah met his eyes with the careful neutrality of a man who'd survived by knowing exactly how much truth to show. "With respect, Marshal, if someone in the black community killed those men, he'd be a hero to some, a target to others, and dead either way once white folks found him. Safer for everyone if the killer stays unknown. White folks get their investigation, colored folks get their mystery, and maybe, just maybe, night riders think twice before their next raid." "So you're saying the black community is conspiring to protect a murderer?" "I'm saying, sir, that 32 men died in a fire, and investigating that fire might reveal who they were, what they did on those Saturday nights, which families they terrorized, which children they orphaned. Sometimes mysteries stay mysterious, because too many people benefit from not knowing the truth." Cole had no response to this. His investigation had already uncovered details about the deceased that their widows and children would prefer stayed buried. The rape of a 14-year-old girl by 3 Klan members in January. The beating death of a freedman who testified at a federal hearing. The systematic burning of black-owned businesses across 2 counties. Every rock he turned over revealed rot underneath, making him question whether solving this case would serve justice or simply provide martyrs for a cause already drowning in innocent blood. From Federal Marshal Cole's private journal, March 19, 1876. "The Carter Negro is either innocent or the most disciplined liar I've encountered. His mother's testimony is unshakable. Without physical evidence or witnesses, I cannot justify arrest. The community, both black and white, seems content to let this remain unsolved. Perhaps that is its own form of justice. The investigation officially closed on March 23rd, classified as arson by person or persons unknown. The federal government withdrew its resources, local authorities filed the case as unsolved, and Selma returned to the careful dance of post-war Southern life. Whites maintaining dominance through economics and custom. Blacks navigating survival through deference and hidden resistance. But something had shifted in that dance's rhythm. Klan activity in Dallas County dropped by 70% over the following 6 months. Night raids that had been weekly occurrences became rare events. The hooded riders who terrorized freedmen with impunity suddenly discovered caution, their midnight bravado tempered by the knowledge that terror could flow both directions, that anonymous violence might purchase anonymous retaliation. Other counties noticed. By summer's end, 3 more Klan lodges across Alabama had mysteriously burned. Though none with casualties, the perpetrators, whoever they were, seemed content with destroying infrastructure rather than killing occupants. The message was clear. Your meeting places aren't safe. Your secrecy isn't guaranteed. Your violence has consequences. Elijah continued his blacksmith work, his reputation for quality growing as white customers convinced themselves that quiet, reliable labor proved innocence. He shod horses for farmers and merchants, repaired wagon wheels, crafted hinges and horseshoes with the same steady competence that had built his alibi. When customers asked about the fire, he expressed appropriate sorrow for the tragedy, agreed that justice should be served, offered no opinions about who might be responsible. His mother, Mary Carter, died peacefully in her sleep on August 2nd, 1876. Her funeral drew 300 mourners, black and white alike, all paying respects to a woman who'd survived 7 decades of the impossible. At her graveside, as the preacher spoke about heaven's rewards, Elijah stood with dry eyes and steady hands, knowing that his mother had gone to her rest, carrying one final secret. The truth about that March evening when her son hadn't been home reading scripture, when she'd lied to a federal marshal with the conviction of someone who understood that some truths served evil better than justice. She'd been enslaved for 60 years. She knew when rules deserved breaking. The investigation's failure to produce an arrest frustrated some whites, satisfied others, and taught everyone a lesson about the limits of authority when communities decided silence served their interests better than revelation. The 32 dead men became martyrs in some circles, cautionary tales in others, depending on which version of their story you chose to believe. But in blacksmith shops and kitchens, in fields and churches where freedmen gathered, the unsolved case of the burning lodge became something else entirely. Proof that the powerless weren't always helpless, that monsters could be trapped in their own lairs, that sometimes justice wore work clothes and carried a hammer instead of a gavel. Elijah Carter never confessed, never celebrated, never spoke of that night to anyone except in the privacy of his own thoughts, where his sister's ghost could finally rest, knowing her husband's murderers had paid a debt written in flame and ash. Word traveled through the South like wildfire through dried grass, each retelling adding layers of myth to fact. By April 1876, newspapers from Atlanta to Richmond were reporting the Selma Lodge burning, though their accounts varied wildly depending on editorial sympathies. The Montgomery Advertiser called it a savage Negro uprising that demands swift retribution. The Pennsylvania Freeman, an abolitionist paper, described it as righteous consequences visited upon domestic terrorists. Both versions circulated through communities already fractured by Reconstruction's promises and failures, each side reading confirmation of what they already believed about race, violence, and justice in the post-war South. The Klan's response revealed divisions within their own ranks. Hardliners demanded massive retaliation, public lynchings, burned homesteads, a campaign of terror so overwhelming that no freedman would dare resist white supremacy again. But moderates, if that word could apply to men who wore hoods and committed racial violence, counseled caution. 32 dead members represented lost leadership, lost manpower, and most importantly, lost secrecy. The burning had exposed their meeting location, their organization's vulnerability, the fact that someone had been watching and planning with lethal precision. Some Klan chapters dissolved entirely, their members deciding that fraternal terrorism wasn't worth dying for. Others adapted, changing meeting locations weekly, posting armed guards, abandoning the lodges altogether for open-air gatherings where barricades became impossible. The calculus of intimidation had shifted. It was harder to terrorize effectively when you feared becoming the terrorized. In Selma's black community, the unspoken knowledge of who'd committed the burning created a protective silence more effective than any alibi. Everyone knew, no one said, and the conspiracy of quiet became its own form of power. When federal authorities tried recruiting informants with cash rewards, they found no takers. The money wasn't worth the target it would paint on your back, and besides, some secrets were worth more than currency. Elijah's blacksmith shop became an unlikely gathering place. Men would stop by for legitimate business, a horse needing shoes, a wagon needing repair, but linger afterward, talking about weather and crops and nothing in particular, their real communication happening in glances and careful phrasings. They never discussed the fire directly, never thanked Elijah explicitly, but the respect in their eyes spoke volumes. He'd done what many had dreamed but none had dared, transformed rage into action, survived the aftermath. One visitor stood out. In late April, a freedman named Isaiah Wells traveled from Montgomery specifically to commission ironwork, decorative gates for a church he was building. The commission was legitimate, but the conversation that accompanied it wasn't about metalwork. "Heard you do quality work," Isaiah said, watching Elijah measure iron stock. "I try to satisfy customers. Heard you're good with fire too, controlling it, making it do what needs doing." Elijah continued working, his face revealing nothing. "Fire's part of blacksmithing. Heat metal till it's workable, shape it, cool it down. Simple process if you understand the principles." Isaiah nodded slowly. "We got problems in Montgomery. Night Rider's been active. Some folks wondering if what happened in Selma might happen elsewhere." "Can't speak to what happened in Selma. Wasn't there?" "No, of course not." Isaiah paused, weighing his next words. "But if someone knew how to, say, make a structure secure from the outside, make sure folks inside couldn't get out if something unfortunate occurred, that knowledge might be valuable to communities facing similar troubles." This was dangerous territory. Elijah set down his tools, meeting Isaiah's eyes directly. "That kind of knowledge is a death sentence for whoever uses it. Federal marshals investigate, Klan retaliates, you end up decorating a tree branch. Man would be a fool to spread that around. Unless enough men used it that investigations couldn't focus on individuals, unless resistance became widespread instead of isolated. One burning is murder, 10 burnings is a pattern, 20 is a movement. The mathematics of revolution versus revenge." Elijah returned to his work, speaking carefully. "Movement needs organization, communication, planning. That kind of coordination gets infiltrated, betrayed. Safer if each man makes his own decisions, acts according to his own conscience, doesn't know what others are doing. That way, when marshals come asking questions, you genuinely don't know anything beyond your own actions. Isaiah absorbed this, understanding the implied strategy. Decentralized resistance, no hierarchy to decapitate, no organization to infiltrate, just individual acts of retaliation that added up to systemic pushback. It was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. You're a wise man, Elijah Carter. Just a blacksmith who understands iron. Heat it right, it bends. Heat it too much, it breaks. Everything has its breaking point. After Isaiah left, Elijah wondered if he'd said too much or not enough. The burning had been personal. Vengeance for his sister, justice for his brother-in-law. But what Isaiah was suggesting was something larger, more dangerous, a coordinated campaign of counter-terror that could either liberate the South or drown it in blood. That summer proved Isaiah had spread the word effectively. Klan lodges burned in Montgomery on May 12th, in Tuscaloosa on June 3rd, in Mobile on July 9th. None with casualties. The perpetrators seemed content destroying infrastructure, sending messages rather than body counts. Federal investigations found the same pattern. Exterior barricading removed before fire spread too far, suggesting the goal was intimidation rather than murder. The Selma burning remained unique in its lethality, a singular act of total vengeance that others chose not to replicate. But the message was clear. White terrorists no longer held a monopoly on violence. For every black church burned, a Klan lodge might answer with flames. For every freedman lynched, hooded riders might find their meetings disrupted, their members exposed, their families questioning whether racial supremacy was worth the risks. The violence didn't end. Reconstruction's failure would eventually guarantee that, but it recalibrated. Klan activity became more cautious, more selective, less random. The days of killing freedmen for sport or intimidation faced pushback from within white communities themselves, as men who'd tolerated racial terror suddenly worried about consequences. How many lives were saved by 32 deaths? How do you calculate the ethics of preventive burning, of killing terrorists before they could create more victims? Elijah never tried to answer those questions. He worked his forge, shaped iron, lived quietly, and watched as the South stumbled toward an uncertain future where power dynamics shifted in ways that Appomattox had promised but failed to deliver. The burning had changed nothing and everything. Slavery's legacy remained, but the assumption of unchallenged white violence had cracked like poorly tempered steel. And in that crack, something new grew, fragile, dangerous, but undeniably alive. Autumn brought cooler air and hotter tensions, the kind that made men check shadows before speaking. October 15th, 1876, marked 7 months since the Selma burning, and the Klan had finally regrouped enough to plan retaliation. Not against Elijah specifically, they still lacked proof, but against the black community broadly, collective punishment for individual defiance. A barn burning here, a beating there, carefully calibrated violence designed to reassert dominance without triggering another wave of lodge fires. But someone was watching their watchers. Elijah had developed the habit of evening walks, mapping the territory around Selma with the thoroughness of a military scout. He noted which roads Klan members traveled, which properties they passed, which routes offered ambush opportunities. He wasn't planning another burning. That had been personal, singular, complete. But he understood that survival in Reconstruction Alabama meant staying 3 steps ahead of men who wanted him dead, whether they could prove his guilt or not. On one such walk, October 21st, he spotted something that made his blacksmith's instincts flare. Fresh tracks leading to an abandoned tobacco barn 2 miles from town, multiple horses, the kind of gathering that happened in darkness for purposes honest men didn't require. The Klan was meeting again, adapting after their losses, and this time they'd chosen a structure with multiple exits, learned from their dead brother's mistake. Elijah observed from distance, counting arrivals. 19 men, including several he recognized from his shop. Customers who smiled while he shod their horses, who paid on time and discussed weather, who transformed after sunset into something that required hoods to face themselves. Among them was Deputy Marshal Wickham, the Ohio transplant who'd investigated the lodge burning, who'd slowly been absorbed into the very organization he was supposed to suppress. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so deadly. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. When members emerged, Elijah noted they carried torches and rope, heading southeast toward the Johnson homestead, where a freedman family had recently purchased 40 acres of farmland. The Johnsons were the kind of success story that enraged white supremacists. Educated, prosperous, visible proof that emancipation could work if given honest chance. Their prosperity made them targets. Elijah faced a choice: go home to safety, or intervene in violence that wasn't yet his business, but would become his responsibility through inaction. He chose a third option. The Johnson farm sat at the end of a narrow road bordered by dense woods. Elijah knew that road, had traveled it delivering metalwork to their property. He also knew that half a mile before the farm, the road crossed a wooden bridge over a creek bed that ran low in autumn. 19 men on horseback would have to cross single file or risk their mounts stumbling in darkness. Bridges burn as easily as lodges. What would you do with 20 minutes warning and a chance to stop a lynching? Would you alert authorities who might be complicit? Would you warn the targets and hope they could defend themselves? Or would you remove the road entirely, force the hunters to choose between abandonment and dangerous detour? Elijah reached the bridge at 10:40 p.m., the Klan riders 15 minutes behind him, based on their travel speed. He'd brought his blacksmith tools out of habit, always carrying basics for emergency repairs. Now those tools served different purpose: prying up boards, weakening supports, creating a structure that would hold under individual weight, but collapse under the combined force of 19 horses and riders moving together. The creek bed below was only 5 feet deep, rocky but not lethal. A fall would injure pride and possibly bones, scatter the group, force them to reconsider their raid. It wouldn't kill them. Elijah had learned from the lodge burning that mass death, however justified in moment, brought consequences that lingered longer than satisfaction. He worked fast, testing each modification to ensure partial collapse rather than total failure. The bridge needed to betray them at exactly the right moment. After enough riders had committed to crossing that retreat, became impossible but before the full group reached solid ground. Engineering as intervention, carpentry as resistance. At 10:57 p.m., the first riders appeared, torches casting orange light across trees that had witnessed too many night raids to find this one remarkable. Elijah had retreated into woods, watching from concealment as hooded men approached his sabotage, confident in their purpose, unaware that someone had rewritten their evening's script. The lead rider, Deputy Marshal Wickham, crossed safely. So did the second and third. The fourth and fifth were mid-span when the supports gave way, with a crack like gunfire, planks splintering, horses screaming, men shouting as they plunged into the creek bed in a chaos of hooves and torches and cursing that echoed for miles. 3 riders behind them pulled up hard, their horses rearing. The remaining 11, trapped on the far side, faced a choice: abandon the raid or find another route that would add hours to their journey and risk discovery by legitimate authorities. From the creek bed came groans and complaints. Wickham had broken his arm in the fall, his torch extinguished in shallow water. 2 other riders nursed injuries while their horses limped around confused, seeking solid ground. The fallen torches had started small fires in dried brush, nothing serious but enough to create light and confusion. The raid was over before it began. Elijah waited until the Klan members had sorted themselves into defeated groups, some heading back to town, others debating futile detours, before slipping away through woods that knew his footsteps better than any white man's. By midnight he was home, tools cleaned and stored, his alibi once again airtight. He'd been reading by lamplight. His neighbors would swear to it. Just another quiet evening for a blacksmith who kept to himself. The Johnsons woke the next morning to rumors of a failed raid, a collapsed bridge, Klan members injured and humiliated, but unable to explain what they'd been doing on that road at that hour. Federal authorities investigated the bridge collapse as structural failure, wood rot, poor maintenance, bad luck. No one questioned whether sabotage might explain the convenient timing. The Klan's frustration grew sharper. 2 major operations disrupted, their members dead or injured, their power diminishing with each failed raid. They knew someone was interfering, but couldn't identify who, couldn't prove intent, couldn't retaliate without risking exposure or further consequences. Elijah Carter remained an enigma wrapped in horseshoes and hot iron, his guilt unprovable, his innocence unconvincing, his usefulness protecting him better than any law. But protection had limits, and the Klan's patience was wearing thin as October faded into November, as their need for revenge sharpened into something desperate and dangerous. November brought frost and desperation in equal measure, both settling over Selma like unwanted guests. The Klan's leadership, what remained of it after the lodge burning, met in a private dining room above Carruthers Tavern on November 8, 1876. 12 men gathered around a table scarred by years of whiskey glasses and dubious decisions, their faces reflecting frustration that had curdled into something darker. They'd lost members, momentum, and most dangerously, their mystique of invincibility. Something had to be done. Someone had to pay. And if they couldn't prove Elijah Carter's guilt, then they'd manufacture circumstances that didn't require proof. William Carruthers, the tavern owner whose son had burned in the lodge, proposed the plan. His voice carried the flat affect of a man who'd moved beyond grief into pure calculation. We can't touch Carter directly. Federal eyes are still watching. But we can create a situation where he has to act, where his nature reveals itself. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. Stage a raid on Carter's shop, make it look like robbery, plant evidence that would justify his arrest and subsequent accidental death in custody. Once he was in a cell, federal protection meant nothing. Prisoners died all the time. Disease, fights, mysterious circumstances that investigations never quite resolved. But they needed Carter to resist, to provide justification for violence. A passive arrest wouldn't serve their purposes. Carruthers' plan involved more bait. Threaten the 4 orphaned children of Thomas and Sarah Washington, Carter's nieces and nephews who'd been taken in by their grandmother's sister. Nothing made a man abandon caution faster than endangered family. If Carter came to their defense, he'd be vulnerable. If he didn't, they'd hurt children anyway and destroy his reputation in the black community. Win either way. The meeting adjourned at 11 p.m. 12 men satisfied they'd found their solution to the Carter problem. What they didn't know: the tavern's Negro porter, a freedman named Moses who served drinks and emptied spittoons while white men forgot he had ears, had heard every word. By midnight, that information had traveled through Selma's black community with the efficiency of telegraph wire, reaching Elijah before dawn on November 9th. Elijah sat in his dark shop, considering options that all tasted like ash. Run and abandon the children to whatever cruelty Carruthers planned. Stay and fight, and die in a cell after a trial that would convict him regardless of evidence. Alert federal authorities, and hope they'd protect him better than they'd protected Thomas Washington or any other freedman who'd trusted white law. Or option 4, spring the trap on his own terms. From Elijah Carter's private journal, discovered decades later, November 9th, 1876. A man can run from fire or walk through it. Either way burns, but at least walking through means choosing your own scars. Tonight, I choose. He spent the day preparing his shop, moving tools, arranging materials, creating what would appear to be normal workspace but functioned as something else entirely. A battlefield disguised as a blacksmith's forge, where every hammer and anvil served dual purpose, where heating iron became heating strategy. The raid came at 9:43 p.m., exactly as Moses had predicted. 8 men, hooded and armed, approaching with the confidence of hunters who'd never considered they might be prey. They carried rope and weapons, intent on a quick abduction that would end with Elijah in custody and the Washington children terrorized into silence about who'd taken their uncle. Elijah met them in his shop's doorway, hands empty, face calm. "Evening, gentlemen. Shop's closed, but I can make appointments for tomorrow." The lead raider, Carruthers, recognizable by build and voice despite the hood, stepped forward. "We got business that won't wait. You're coming with us, Carter. Suspicion of theft, destruction of property, conspiracy to commit murder. Those are serious charges. You have a warrant? Don't need paper to arrest a Negro. Federal law says different, but I suppose some folks prefer old customs to new rules." Elijah shifted position slightly, appearing to relax while actually creating angle toward his forge. "What exactly am I supposed to have stolen?" "Silver candlesticks from Widow Morrison, tools from the livery. Evidence places you at both locations." Fabricated evidence, obviously, but denial wouldn't matter. The trap had sprung, and now Elijah had to navigate its teeth carefully enough to survive while creating witnesses to what was really happening. Not arrest, but kidnapping. Not justice, but murder disguised in legal costume. "I'd like to speak with Marshal Cole about these charges. Federal authority should handle. Federal authority doesn't concern itself with Negro thieves." Carruthers gestured, and 2 men moved to flank Elijah. "You can come quiet or loud, but you're coming." Elijah made his choice. He grabbed a hammer from his belt, the same hammer that had driven nails through lodge doors 7 months ago, and threw it not at any man, but through his shop's front window, shattering glass loudly enough to wake neighbors 3 houses away. Then he shouted, voice carrying across evening air, "Raiders trying to kidnap me! 8 men, hooded, no warrant! Witness this!" Doors opened, faces appeared in windows. The arrest that was supposed to happen in darkness now had an audience, and Carruthers' men hesitated, uncertain whether to proceed with witnesses watching or retreat and lose their opportunity. Carruthers made the fatal choice. Proceed. Seize him! He's resisting arrest! What happened next would be disputed in 3 different investigations, each reaching conclusions shaped more by politics than evidence. The undisputed facts: 8 hooded men attempted to restrain one blacksmith in his own shop, while neighbors watched and shouted questions. Elijah fought with tools and fire, using his forge as weapon, swinging hammers and tongs, creating chaos that prevented the quick abduction Carruthers had planned. The disputed facts: who struck first, who pulled weapons first, whether Elijah's resistance was self-defense or assault, whether the raiders had legitimate authority or were simply lynch mob disguised in legal language. The aftermath was clear. 3 raiders injured seriously enough to require medical attention, 2 more burned by contact with forge fire, and Elijah Carter standing in his shop's ruins, bleeding from multiple wounds but alive and free while dawn approached, and federal marshals finally arrived to sort through the wreckage. Marshal Cole surveyed the scene with the expression of a man whose worst suspicions had been confirmed. 8 hooded men, multiple weapons, no warrant, and a blacksmith who defended himself against what was clearly attempted abduction rather than legitimate arrest. "Someone want to explain," Cole said quietly, "why these men are wearing Klan regalia while conducting what they claim was legal law enforcement?" No one had good answers. Carruthers and his men faced the choice between admitting Klan affiliation or explaining why they'd worn hoods for a routine arrest. Either option led toward federal charges, public exposure, and the kind of consequences white men rarely faced in Reconstruction Alabama, but occasionally couldn't avoid when caught too openly violating laws meant to protect freedmen. The trap had failed. The hunter had become hunted, and Elijah Carter had survived again through a combination of planning, violence, and the simple act of ensuring his persecution had witnesses who couldn't be silenced. But survival came with costs that would reveal themselves in the coming days, in the ways violence changes men even when used in self-defense, in the reality that winning battles doesn't prevent wars. December's cold settled into bones and decisions alike, making both harder to bear. Elijah Carter sat in Marshal Cole's office on December 3, 1876, answering questions for the 5th time in 3 weeks. The attempted abduction had triggered federal intervention that Dallas County whites resented and black residents welcomed with cautious hope. 8 men faced charges, ranging from assault to conspiracy to violate civil rights. Serious accusations that might actually result in convictions if Cole could navigate Alabama's legal system without getting undermined by local sympathizers. "You fought well for a blacksmith," Cole observed, reviewing medical reports detailing the raiders' injuries. "Almost like you'd planned for that exact scenario. Man plans for rain by keeping a roof in good repair. I keep my tools accessible because trouble doesn't make appointments." Cole studied him with the intensity of someone trying to read a book in failing light. 3 separate incidents: the lodge burning, the bridge collapse, now this raid. You're either incredibly unlucky or incredibly capable. I can't decide which troubles me more. "Maybe I'm just a blacksmith trying to survive in Alabama, sir. Sometimes survival looks like capability, when it's really just desperation with better timing." The marshal leaned back, weighing his next words carefully. "Carruthers and his men will go to trial in January. Federal court, which means actual chance of conviction. But trials create targets. Witnesses tend to disappear or change their testimony when they realize testifying against white men can be hazardous to health." "You asking me to testify?" "I'm asking if you'll still be alive to testify. Because once that trial date is public knowledge, you become the most important obstacle to 8 men's freedom. and desperate men do desperate things. Elijah had considered this mathematics. Testifying meant painting a larger target on his back. Not testifying meant letting attempted kidnappers walk free, emboldening future raids. Either choice carried risks that sleep couldn't wash away. "I'll testify," he said finally, "but I need protection for the Washington children. They're leverage against me, and Carruthers knows it." Cole nodded slowly. "I can arrange something. Federal safe house in Montgomery until after the trial. It's not perfect, but it's better than hoping the Klan develops sudden conscience." The children, ages 6 through 12, were moved on December 9th under armed escort that included 2 federal soldiers and Marshal Cole himself. Their departure from Selma marked the first time in Reconstruction history that the federal government had explicitly protected black children from white terrorism. It set precedent that other counties noticed, that other freedmen families hoped might extend to their own situations. But precedent without enforcement was just paper promises. Christmas 1876 passed with uneasy quiet. Elijah worked his forge, accepted commissions, lived under the kind of scrutiny that made ordinary tasks feel like performance art. Every customer might be an informant. Every evening walk might end in ambush. The stress carved lines into his face that age alone couldn't explain, turning a 33-year-old man into someone who looked 50. In late December, a visitor arrived who changed Elijah's calculations entirely. Reverend Henry McNeil Turner, a prominent black minister and politician, stopped in Selma during a speaking tour about freedmen's rights. Turner had connections throughout the South, had witnessed Reconstruction's promises and failures firsthand, and had developed strong opinions about how black communities should respond to white terrorism. They met in the back room of Turner's church, privacy guaranteed by congregation members who understood the value of discretion. "You're the one who burned the lodge," Turner said without preamble. "I'm not asking. I'm observing. I've seen enough men who've killed to recognize the weight they carry." Elijah said nothing, which was answer enough. Turner continued, "What you did, whether I approve morally, is irrelevant. What matters is the effect. Klan activity decreased across 3 states after Selma. Other freedmen found courage to resist. You created ripples that became waves. But waves eventually crash, and I'm concerned you're standing where the water will hit hardest." "You suggesting I run?" "I'm suggesting you consider whether dying in Alabama serves your community better than living somewhere else. Martyrs are useful for inspiring others, but living examples accomplish more. There are places up north, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, where your skills would be valued and your past wouldn't follow you. My past follows me everywhere, Reverend. Geography doesn't wash away what I've done. No, but it might keep you alive long enough to do more good than harm. The trial's in January. Testify, help convict those men, then seriously consider whether remaining in Selma serves justice or just satisfies some notion that running equals cowardice." The conversation ended without resolution, but Turner's words lodged in Elijah's mind like splinters. He'd survived the lodge burning, the investigation, the attempted abduction, but survival had been luck as much as skill, and luck eventually ran out. How many times could one man defy white supremacy in the heart of Alabama before the mathematics of violence caught up? The trial was scheduled for January 15th, 1877. As the date approached, tensions in Selma thickened like humidity before storms. White citizens organized support rallies for the accused, painting them as victims of federal overreach and Negro aggression. Black residents stayed quiet publicly while privately preparing for potential violence. stockpiling supplies, organizing watch rotations, creating evacuation plans in case the trial's outcome triggered retaliation. On January 8th, a week before trial, someone fired shots through Elijah's shop window at 2 a.m. The bullets missed him. He'd taken to sleeping in a different location each night. But the message was clear. The Klan wanted him dead or intimidated into silence before he could testify. Cole increased protection, assigning guards to watch Elijah's movements. But guards couldn't be everywhere always. The attempt had been warning, not serious assassination effort. The real attempt would come when he was vulnerable, when protection had gaps, when desperation overcame caution. Elijah spent the week before trial making arrangements that looked like a man preparing for possible death, writing letters to his nieces and nephews, documenting his blacksmith techniques for whoever might inherit his shop, settling debts, organizing papers. But he was also preparing for possible life, gathering traveling money, making contacts up north, creating exit strategies in case survival required departure. The night before the trial, he sat alone in his shop, surrounded by tools that had shaped metal and resistance in equal measure. The hammer that had driven nails through lodge doors hung on the wall, innocent as any implement until you knew its history. The forge glowed with residual heat, iron waiting to be transformed by fire and will. How many lives does one burning purchase? How many acts of violence can be justified by the violence they prevent? Elijah had asked himself these questions every day for 9 months, never finding answers that satisfied anything except pragmatic necessity. Tomorrow he would testify. Tomorrow 8 white men would face federal justice for attempting to kidnap a freedman. Tomorrow would reveal whether Reconstruction's promises had any teeth or whether they were just words designed to pacify Northerners while the South returned to old cruelties under new names. And after tomorrow, if he survived, Elijah Carter would have to decide whether the blacksmith who burned a Klan lodge could ever truly escape the smoke of that choice, or whether some fires burned too hot to ever completely extinguish. Even now, some say on cold December nights in Selma, you can still smell kerosene and pine smoke drifting through the woods where that lodge once stood, though the clearing has long since been reclaimed by forest, and official records insist the case was closed as unsolved decades ago. The Dallas County Federal Courthouse stood like a monument to promises the South had never intended to keep. January 15th, 1877, dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning where breath hung visible and decisions felt permanent. By 8 a.m., crowds had gathered outside the courthouse, white citizens supporting the accused, black citizens hoping for justice, federal soldiers maintaining an uneasy perimeter between them. The air carried tension thick enough to choke on, everyone understanding that today's verdict would ripple far beyond 8 men's fates. Elijah arrived under armed escort at 8:45 a.m., wearing his best clothes, a suit purchased specifically for this occasion, armor made of wool and determination. Marshal Cole walked beside him, hand resting on his sidearm, eyes scanning the crowd for threats that could come from any direction. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old wood and newer hatred. The 8 defendants sat in a row, unhooded now, their faces showing various degrees of defiance and fear. Carruthers looked directly at Elijah, his expression promising violence that words couldn't capture. Deputy Marshal Wickham stared at his hands, shame or calculation making him unable to meet anyone's eyes. The others ranged between these extremes, united only in their conviction that testifying against them was Negro insolence deserving punishment. Judge Albert Griffin presided, a Massachusetts native appointed during Reconstruction, specifically because he had no Southern loyalties to cloud his judgment. He called the court to order at 9:15 a.m., his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood this trial's importance, extended beyond individual guilt or innocence. This case concerns not merely alleged assault, Griffin began, but the fundamental question of whether federal law protects all citizens equally or whether some remain subject to violence that local authorities will not address. The nation watches what we do here today. Elijah took the stand at 10 a.m. The prosecutor, a federal attorney named Marcus Whitfield, led him through testimony that built piece by piece. The attempted abduction, the lack of warrant, the hoods identifying defendants as Klan members, the injuries sustained defending himself. Elijah spoke clearly, factually, without embellishment or emotion, letting events speak their own condemnation. "Did you recognize any of the men who entered your shop that night?" Whitfield asked. "Yes, sir. William Carruthers, who owns the tavern. Deputy Marshal James Wickham. The others I knew by build and voice, even with hoods. They're customers who've been in my shop many times." The defense attorney, a local man named Sutton who'd built his career defending white supremacy with legal language, attacked during cross-examination. "Mr. Carter, isn't it true you've been suspected of multiple crimes, including the burning of a Klan lodge that killed 32 men?" "I was investigated and cleared of that suspicion, sir. No charges were filed." "Cleared or simply unprovable? Isn't it true you have every reason to hate these men, to fabricate testimony that would see them imprisoned?" Elijah met his eyes steadily. "I have reason to want justice, sir. My brother-in-law was lynched by Klan members. My sister died from grief. Those are facts, not fabrications. But what happened in my shop on November 9th had witnesses. Neighbors who heard me shout about the raid, who saw 8 hooded men trying to drag me away. Their testimony matches mine because it's true, not because it's fabricated." The trial continued for 3 days. Neighbors testified about what they'd witnessed. Medical testimony detailed injuries consistent with Elijah's account of self-defense. The prosecution presented the hoods found at the scene, the weapons carried without legal authority, the complete absence of any warrant or legitimate law enforcement purpose. The defense claimed the raid was legal arrest of a suspected criminal, that Elijah had resisted violently, that Klan affiliation was irrelevant to whether proper procedures were followed. But their arguments crumbled against the weight of evidence. No warrant, no legitimate charges, no explanation for why legal arrest required hoods and midnight timing. On January 18th, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. All white men. No black citizens had been allowed to serve despite federal law theoretically permitting it. Their verdict would reveal whether racial solidarity trumped evidence or whether some white Southerners could prioritize law over loyalty. On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights, how do you find? The foreman, a store owner from outside Dallas County, stood slowly. "Guilty on all counts, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted. White spectators shouted protests. Black observers wept with relief and disbelief. The defendants sat stunned, unable to process that their race hadn't protected them, that a Negro's testimony had actually resulted in their conviction. Judge Griffin hammered for order, his voice cutting through chaos. "The defendants are remanded to federal custody pending sentencing. This court stands adjourned." Elijah sat motionless as celebration and outrage swirled around him. He'd won, justice had been served. 8 men who'd tried to kidnap him would face prison. But the victory tasted hollow as ash, because he understood what everyone celebrating didn't. This conviction was exception, not rule. For every successful prosecution, 100 acts of racial terrorism went unpunished. For every freedman who survived to testify, dozens died without witnesses or justice. The trial changed nothing and everything, just like the burning had. Marshal Cole escorted Elijah out through a back entrance, avoiding crowds that might turn violent. "You did well in there," helped make history. First successful federal prosecution of Klan members in Alabama for violating freedmen's civil rights. First of how many, Marshal? How many trials before black folks can live without fear? How many convictions before terror becomes illegal in practice instead of just on paper? Cole had no answer, because there was no answer. Just the grinding, slow work of trying to build justice in soil that grew hatred more easily than hope. The convicted men were sentenced to federal prison terms ranging from 5 to 10 years. They served less than half those sentences before political changes during the 1877 Compromise ended Reconstruction, released political prisoners, and returned the South to white Democratic control that would maintain racial oppression for another 80 years. But for a brief moment in January 1877, justice had been possible. Elijah Carter left Alabama on February 2nd, boarding a train to Chicago with forged papers identifying him as Elias Freeman, blacksmith seeking work in northern industry. Reverend Turner had been right. Survival meant departure, living to fight differently rather than dying in battles that would continue with or without him. He took his skills, his memories, and his hammer north to a city where he could disappear into crowds of freedmen and immigrants, where his past might rest, if not forgotten, then at least distant enough to allow breathing. The blacksmith shop in Selma was sold to another freedman who understood its history, who kept the hammer that had driven those nails displayed on the wall as reminder of what was possible when desperation met determination. The Washington children grew up safe in Montgomery, raised by their great aunt, carrying stories of an uncle who'd fought back when fighting back seemed impossible. And in Chicago, a man who was no longer quite Elijah Carter built a new forge, shaped new iron, and taught young freedmen not just blacksmithing, but the harder lesson, that survival sometimes required fire, that justice sometimes wore work clothes instead of robes, that the powerless weren't always helpless if they understood leverage, timing, and the terrible mathematics of resistance. The Selma Lodge burning remained officially unsolved, filed away in courthouse records that would gather dust for a century before historians discovered them and tried to reconstruct what happened that March night when 32 hooded men learned that terror has consequences, that anonymity can become a trap, that the oppressed sometimes choose fire over submission. Some mysteries deserve solving. Others serve their purpose better staying mysterious, teaching lessons through whispered stories rather than documented facts, living in the space between history and legend where truth becomes whatever the teller needs it to be. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.